Today, there are many places where people interested in Buddhism can practice and meditate. But in 1971, the network of friends that made up the FWBO had each other, a community in Surrey, and 2 large retreats a year, but no centre. For the last 4 years, Sakura had been its central London base. But when the lease expired, the movement was on the streets. Keeping the small movement intact during a long period of wandering was difficult. Still, some FWBO classes did take place, as Buddhadasa recalls.
Week by week, we would keep classes going in various different premises. And we would try to find the premises for next week, the previous week, and announce them at the class and say, this is where we'll be next week, see you there. And maybe it would be a restaurant or another room that we would hire from an alternative group.
During the early 70s, many old ideas were jettisoned and radicalism was in the air. The torrent of new ideas could either invigorate or unhinge the people most attracted to the FWBO. Despite the outrageous optimism of the time, the movement itself was vulnerable without a base. It had to steer a course through a soup of astrology, magic, therapy, New Age dreams, and political anarchy. Added to this, there was boundless faith that psychedelic drugs would lead to clarity.
I found acid would make my mind race, and I'd sort of be able to see behind things and behind things and behind things in an intellectual fashion.
If I had never got involved in drugs, I would have probably been an alcoholic plumber, divorced.
I had a couple of acid trips, as they were called in those days, which were very positive, and I'm quite glad I had them. But the experience, I felt, was not really quite the same, or at all the same as meditative experience.
The FWBO being the kind of movement group that it was, it would attract people who'd done bioenergetics, who'd done Rolfing, who'd done this, that and the other, who'd slept in pyramids, and they'd go on about it. And so we'd try things out, and inevitably we started doing our own little bits of Gestalt and our own little bits of this, that and the other.
Just like Primal Scream, Gestalt was a new therapy imported from the West Coast. One group meant to explore dream psychology.
Mumki was setting up her dream groups, and one of them met at my house, in my room.
And then as soon as I became consciously aware of how I'd blocked this anger, it just came out in a incredible sort of rush and took me over completely. And it was frightening.
The first Buddhist book I read was Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I don't think I understood, but I did like that whole approach. It wasn't just Theravadan, dry Buddhism. Buddhism had lots of aspects.
A bunch of us would meet at Manjuvajra and Dhammadina's flat and reenact the Tibetan Book of the Dead, paint each other different colours, do all sorts of weird things, usually under the influence of dope.
Naga Bodhi was the Lama, sort of guiding my consciousness through the realms.
The explorations continued right through to that year's summer retreat at Kefauves, which became a sort of festival. Leaving behind their work at the BBC, Naga Bodhi and Padmaraja drove down to Surrey.
We were too late for lunch, so we went into the kitchen where Dhammadina and Kema were cooking the evening meal. They'd started work on the soup. And Dhammadina gave me a cheese sandwich, then started stirring the soup. And in the middle of stirring the soup, she turned to Kema and said, is your left hand yin or yang? And Kmart just, with total spontaneous authority, said, "Oh, yin," and carried on doing what she was doing. And for a little while I thought, I'm in the wrong place. There were, just the lovely experiences of going for walks with pretty girls with whom you felt quite free because you were doing communication exercises and feeling very open, and to somebody very sort of shy about that sort of thing, it was magic. At the end of 2 weeks of that retreat, I was just totally sold on the FWBO. And to be honest, I don't know whether it was because I was in love, or whether it was the excitement about meditation, or the pujas, or about bhante.
I just felt like I wanted to hug a tree. I just felt something awakening in me.
When I used to go home, it was so boring. There was no books, there was no, apart from my room with a record player and a few posters, the house was really dull. It was kind of grey.
There were demonstrations too in Britain, anti the Vietnam War and by the newly formed Gay Liberation Front.
Part of that greyness, part of getting rid of that kind of conventional morality, if you like, was to experiment not only with mind-expanding drugs, if you like, but with your own sexuality, especially homosexual relationships. I passed a couple of people in the street, and I wonder if they know. Can they tell? There's something about me. Can you read off of me somehow that I've just slept with a man?
Despite the 1968 reforms, a generalised prejudice against male homosexuality was a source of negative fear and guilt. Sangharakshita encouraged people to confront these issues.
He used to sort of speak out against, the Christian conditioning, which often, makes people feel very sort of guilty, particularly in the area of expressing sexual feelings and having sexual emotions and so on. So yeah, that was very encouraging, very sort of liberating.
The quest for liberty, equality and fraternity was not helping the FWBO find a centre. Two men, however, faced the problem head-on.
During that period, I was also out on the streets of Banting, and we would go looking for property, any property that might serve for a centre. And I remember very clearly seeing on Banting's face almost a look of desperation as he looked for a place in which he could house this new fledgling movement, because as the weeks went by, it seemed that we were losing more and more people because we didn't have our own place.
The search lasted 15 months, until at the end of the year, Camden Council offered some premises.
Yes, this is Belmore Street, and quite a bit has changed since I first came here. That's remarkable. There used to be a pub there, which was occupied by the IRA, but now we just see all new houses.
This part of North London had been in a state of terrible decay for decades, whilst waiting for the redevelopers to demolish it.
Highgate New Town is a standing joke among the people living in the closely packed, dingy Victorian terrace houses. Most are damp, many have no bathrooms and shared lavatories, many are built so close together that they cut off the daylight from each other.
I suppose the main place of interest is the site of the first centre that we owned in the movement, which is just about here. The place was filthy. It was in a state of severe neglect. Inside had been torn apart. And really all we had was just two spaces upstairs and downstairs. And I remember Banji just turning to me and said, "Well, do you think you could do it?" And I said, "Well, I'll give it a go."
Buddhadasa gave up his job as a designer to become the first full-time order member, and the transformation began.
It had obviously been a disused piano factory, because within the building itself we found a number of old piano frames, and we used to play tunes on these things with bits of wood that happened to be lying around. week by week, an improvement could be seen. A cat appeared, named Basho, who rapidly became a legend in its own lifetime. Within days of moving there, we had our first meditation class, and class was very quickly up and running. One of the first things I built was a tea counter. Tea has always been associated very strongly with the FWBO, and I built this enormous tea counter out of doors, a bit like an aircraft carrier, and big kettles, and I used to greet people standing behind this big tea counter, pouring tea for newcomers and people coming along from the centre.
The new headquarters had at first the name Archway Buddhist Center. Here Sangharakshita gave his series of talks, The Symbols of the Tantric Path.
The world of the Asuras, the anti-gods, the Titans, and these are all fierce and warlike beings. They're usually depicted as stoutly and strong.
Bhante was on very good form indeed. And I was very interested in symbols. I've been very interested in Jung, particularly in Jung, and thereby in the whole field of symbols and the archetypes of the unconscious and so forth, so that this lecture series really rang a very strong bell.
Meanwhile, down at the community in Surrey,
Ananda opened the door, and Ananda said, well, whose friend are you? So I explained that I'd written, and it'd been said that I could come down, so he let me in. And we let into I think we met in the front room of Aretara. And it was just mind-boggling. Everyone, I suppose about 30 people, sat round in a massive circle, all banging spoons and cups and things, while Vajradhaka and Kema sort of pranced about together in the middle of the room. But I think what I got out of it was a feeling of Sangha. I mean, I didn't express it, I didn't understand that term then, I probably hardly heard of the word. But a feeling of community, and I think that's what attracted me, and I thought, well, this is, I want to know more.
the spirit of Sangha, or spiritual community, now a more characteristic quality of the FWBO, was difficult to explain and hard to bring into being.
Yes, well, I remember this photograph being taken. It was in April 1972, on the occasion of my ordination, but I was also ordained with Padmaraja, Vajrabodhi and Vajradhaka as well. There were 4 of us ordained on that occasion. I think it was the first ordination that had taken place for about 2 years, because after Bhante's previous experience with the earlier order members, he said on this occasion that he wanted to be sure that those people that he was ordaining would stay around.
During 1968 and 69, 26 people were ordained into the Western Buddhist order, but few of them still took an active part in the movement's affairs.
Well, obviously a lot of people were left behind because they resigned. I think a lot of people found it a threat because they were not prepared to take on the implications of what Sangha meant.
We were not so conservative as these people. We were prepared to give anything a go, give anything a try. And within our own lives, we had much more flexibility, I think. We were, in a way, we were prepared to change. So unfortunately, some of them did fall by the wayside. But I don't think they should ever be forgotten, because they, after all, were the people who started the movement. And they should be appreciated, every single one of them, for what they did at that time.
The most important retreat, I'd say, in the history of the movement, though, at that stage, was the Kefal's retreat in 72. Bhante decided that it was time to be a bit more of a master, to sort of call the shots. He started to talk about mindfulness in a big way.
We did the first triple meditations we'd ever done before breakfast, and then we did the 6 element practice every day, and hours of communication exercises and lots of silence. It was much more intense.
It's difficult, in fact, to keep one's mindfulness, and sort of keep the continuity of what you're doing, keep it flowing and be concentrated at the same time.
had very good meditation experiences on that retreat. And I think that was the retreat that motivated a lot of people not to go back to the lifestyles they were in, but to live together.
Several communities were growing in run-down premises around the Archway Centre. At the start they were mixed, but this produced problems of stress when there were couples living in them. How then did the move towards single-sex communities come about?
I think when we first thought about living together, we hadn't thought of just living with men, but Bhante encouraged us very strongly to do that. And I think that had a woman who we strongly wanted to live with us, we might at that time have gone against his advice. But as it turned out, that didn't happen. And I think soon we did appreciate very much the point of a men's community. And after that, there was no question of changing it.
I experienced the benefits just in terms of lessened tension. The whole area of sex was at the time a little bit difficult for me. And so I was just really relieved not to have that sort of tension.
The 1972 summer retreat was the last ever held at Kefauld's. That autumn, other very significant retreats were held. In September, Sangharakshita led a weekend retreat for men.
I found that very good retreat indeed, much more useful than the large mixed retreat at Kefauld's the previous year. And I think then probably I began to understand the significance of single-sex situations more fully and appreciate it.
A couple of months later, Gautami led a weekend retreat for women.
I think we found it a good experience, but Sangharakshita said he might come, so we waited for him, and he didn't come. So that was interesting because he left us to our own devices, and we had to realise that, and that we could have a retreat without him, which was very unusual. So one minute we were in a study group with Bhante or with another order member, and the next minute we were leading things like that.
Sangharakshita may have been encouraging people for years to develop same-sex friendships through spending more time with each other, but it was only when people had a tangible experience of the benefits that the idea seemed appealing. Another of his teachings, on the virtue of the path of regular steps, became much clearer on a series of retreats led by visiting Zen teachers.
I remember at the sort of peak of sesshin, you were practicing from 4 o'clock in the morning till midnight, and you didn't leave the shrine room except for a very short walk after lunch. But what I realised after a while was that Bhante was the strongest disciplinarian of them all, because he didn't actually push you or tell you to do things. And he just sort of encouraged you and gave you the sort of path, if you like, or pointed out the path to you. But you had to go and do it, and you weren't being pushed or prodded to go that way, which isn't like that in Zen. They're very much sort of like you are Buddha nature. You have Buddha nature, and if you practice in the right way, then you'll realise that. It's quite a different sort of approach.
One infamous retreat became the occasion to appreciate Sangharakshita's particular approach, when Zengo, then a protege of the FWBO, declared he was Maitreya, the future Buddha.
He was the new Buddha. The old Buddha was fair enough. Shakyamuni had done a good job, but it was time for a new dispensation, for a new age. The Four Noble Truths were okay so far as they went, but he had 3 new truths to offer us, the truth of original perfection, the truth of sort of confusion, and then the truth of final perfection. Sort of first there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is, in a sense. I mean, it's just straightforward Zen teaching, but he was putting this now as the 3 noble truths of the Buddha Maitreya. And, basically the message was if we were going to benefit from him, we could, if we want, join up with him, we could be part of this. But anyway, it might be a good idea to treat him with a bit more respect.
The news, though exciting, was confusing. Sangharakshita wrote to the retreatants praising Zengo's qualities as a meditation teacher, adding that for a Buddha to appear in the world, the work and influence of the current Buddha, Shakyamuni, had first to disappear completely. This was not the case. so perhaps the Venerable Zengo had become so distanced from his teachers that he was suffering from spiritual inflation, a known danger for the comparatively advanced practitioner.
Obviously, the teacher must not encourage the disciple or anybody to see himself, that is to see the teacher in a way that is false. And sometimes teachers or so-called teachers do put on sort of airs and graces and even try to cultivate a sort of charisma, or perhaps we should say pseudo-charisma. And that certainly gets in the way of communication. But then a teacher of that kind is not really concerned with communication. He's concerned just with providing the disciple with a hook for his projections. And perhaps he has a personal need for the disciple to do that. That isn't at all a healthy situation in my view.
During the early 70s, FWBO activities were spreading abroad. Vajradhaka took on leading a Dutch Gestalt group on their Christmas retreat, whilst a couple of months later Gautami set off for New Zealand. There, the future Dharmajyoti had established a group in Christchurch, and for 2 years they'd been studying Sangharakshita's writings. 700 miles away to the north, an expat Englishman, Akshobhya, was leading similar activities in Auckland and had asked Bhante to make a visit.
We felt, they'd gone to the limit of his knowledge, and Bhante still wasn't able to go. And so he said to me, well, I think it's about time somebody went, and it'd better be you. So I, oh, my goodness me, He said, you know what to do. So I went. And the New Zealand group paid my fare out, and were very kind to me and very friendly to me. And, I had a thoroughly good time. They're a fantastic group of people out there. Very, very, very eager, just ready to blossom, like the flowers.
The first Finnish order member, Vajrabodhi, returned along with the newly ordained Bodhi Shri, and they started classes in Helsinki.
When we had been ordained, I thought it was the most natural thing for us to start a center. In the very beginning we had just this one man who was interested in meditation. But then, a bit later, people started to arrive. Parapsychologists and people into therapy and people into yoga. But Vajrabodhi was very good with them. He really enjoyed arguing with them. He really had a good time, fighting against their mithraditthis.
Sangharakshita had been back in the UK for 9 busy years, first pacifying a warring British Sangha, and then for 5 years guiding the steps of a new movement. In 1973, he left the order members in charge of the Archway Centre and went on a year's sabbatical to a seaside chalet in Cornwall.
I wanted to give myself the opportunity of experiencing some unprogrammed energy, because my energy was almost entirely tied up with classes, lectures, retreats. So I wanted to experience some unprogrammed energy. And I did, and I used it, or much of it, to finish the 1,000-petaled lotus. But I had some other interesting experiences. One of them was that when I was meditating, especially when I was doing the Metta-Bhavana, I actually experienced myself as being surrounded by all the order members. Not that I was just thinking of them, but they were actually there. So that made me realize that the link between us was not just a physical one. It existed on another subtler level. There was something perhaps even more interesting that I can't really put into words, but it was from that time that I started developing or started following an interest in Sufism. I didn't read any Sufi books, but it was as though it was a purely inner experience that I had access to the Sufi spiritual world.
I don't think he'd said he was going for a year. He just went off to Cornwall. I think we even felt perhaps he wouldn't come back in so many words. And actually he didn't, because he didn't ever come back and start running things again.
So there were 4 or 5 of us who ran everything. And we had done nothing before that. We hadn't led any classes or anything. He just sort of dropped us in the deep end, really, with it. And then through 1973, he would invite us to meet him in various locations. Like the first time was to meet him on the summer solstice at Stonehenge. And we then drove to the New Forest to camp for 5 days. And during that 5 days in the New Forest, he basically started to unfold to us his dream of the FWBO and how he envisioned it unfolding.
Nothing was fixed, nothing was rigid. You could, the Dharma was a practical thing, and the rules were dependent upon the situation in hand, what was actually obtaining at the time. I remember him saying the only thing that he didn't foresee ever changing was the refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. Everything else was very fluid and open.
Frequently over the years, Sangharakshita had left London to visit other parts of Britain, stirring life into some new groups. The Glasgow Buddhist group now wanted more contact with the order, so again Gautami rose to the occasion.
I wrote the lecture in the train on the way up, and I gave it. I've no idea now what it was about, but the group of people in Glasgow thereafter invited me to stay. So after I'd been to New Zealand, I went back to Glasgow.
FWBO Glasgow was inaugurated in July 1973, with Gautami as sole incumbent order member. It was a demanding job, particularly as she was so cut off geographically from the rest of the order.
One had been so used to going along to regular order meetings, or even a meditation class. There would be other order members about, there would be other order members living in the vicinity, or probably even living in the same community with you, whatever. So, yes, I did feel personally cut off from the contact with the friends in the order. And, when you're the only order member about, people do tend to put you on a pedestal and expect all sorts of things from you. But really you aren't, because you're just ordinary, you're just practicing and trying the same as they are.
In February 1974, a year after arriving, Gautami's health broke and she left to convalesce in the country.
I was very tired. But I went down to an order retreat or an order convention after a retreat in Purley. And Banti just said, right, you're leaving Glasgow and Vajradhara's going up there. And so it was.
And eventually she burnt out and lost her sense of vision of being able to work within the movement. And eventually she resigned. But I'm very personally grateful to her for the friendship and encouragement and love and care that she gave me. She was fearless, really, in her teaching. And she would do things that none of us at first would do.
A few years later, Gautami resigned from the order. Meanwhile, Vajradhara and Malini had taken over running the Glasgow centre. The movement was expanding, and so was the order. During 1973 and 74, there were nearly 40 ordinations. Where had this inspiration and commitment come from?
Seeing that you could actually change, that you could experience higher states of mind. That was the experience. And then seeing the way order members related, I was very, very impressed.
I came back to a community and was feeling very bright and positive. I just suddenly thought, yes, I'm going to ask for ordination. And I did, and I got accepted.
I decided really to work towards ordination, and I decided this was the life for me.
I heard that Lokomitra had been down to see Bhante, and I decided to ask if I could go down. I remember just sort of coming in, and Bhante was sitting next to the window, sort of cross-legged, the window just on his right, and he seemed very, very subtle and ethereal, almost as if he wasn't quite there, but at the same time a very, very strong presence, as if he was more sort of part of the wind and the waves and the sky. I just remember sort of being with Bhante and saying, well, I suppose I'd better ask for ordination. And he laughed at me. But that was it. I don't really know why I did it. I didn't sort of premeditate it or think it through. It just seemed sort of the obvious next thing to do. I think what it was that in seeing Bhante, I had tremendous faith and confidence in him. And, he'd set up an order, without thinking it all through. It was fairly obvious if that's what he'd set up, then that's what I should do.
On 2 short retreats that summer and autumn, 9 new order members, or upasakas, literally lay followers, were born. They were Ratnapani, Hridaya, Manjuvajra, Mangala, Chintamani, Jitari and Subhuti, and 2 women upasakas, Marichi and Dharmadina.
Nowadays people get told what the order is and etc, etc. I must have just picked that up by osmosis or something. But it was a great retreat, and I enjoyed the ordinations.
Nobody sort of said anything about ordination or explained what it was or what it meant. Nobody sort of questioned me as to what I understood by it, or made sure that I knew what I was doing, or told me what was expected of me, or anything like that.
I remember it quite clearly, and asking for the Tara practice, and Bhante giving me my name, which I thought was an odd name for me to have. I didn't consider myself at that point, giver of the Dharma. I didn't consider myself in that mode, really. So that was interesting, and it sparked something off in me.
Well, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. Particularly the private ordination in the first place. Just feeling that, my deepest aspirations, as it were acknowledged and accepted by somebody for whom I had tremendous admiration and respect. And the next day sort of finding myself in a spiritual community, a tremendous affirmation.
Immediately before the first ever order convention in January 1974, 5 more ordinations were celebrated in Surrey.
It was a very auspicious moment to get ordained. I'm grateful for that there was this convention. And we discussed things like, wouldn't it be good to have a kind of meditation practice that all order members do wherever they are at the same time? So we had the idea of the order metta. Wouldn't it be good if there was a sort of newsletter or something that all order members could contribute to keep in touch with each other, and Shabda was born.
The monthly publication of Shabda, sacred sound in Sanskrit, was and still is a good way for far-flung order members to keep in touch. The Archway Centre was renamed Pundarika, White Lotus in Sanskrit. And when Sangharakshita returned briefly from his sabbatical, he found the atmosphere around the centre changed. Beside a whole food bakery and an arts centre, different Buddhist groups were in residence. Here then was the dawning of a new way of life.
Coming back into London and seeing people in general, and then seeing people within the FWBO, he realised that they were a sort of new breed of humanity, which is really quite striking and exciting.
Sangharakshita returned to Cornwall to finish the first of his memoirs, and then moved to Norfolk. Order members had got used to the work of leading classes and running centres, so he was more free to publish, give talks and see people individually. He also ordained more people. During 1974, he travelled to Holland, Finland and New Zealand, where at the end of the year he performed 12 ordinations, the first overseas. That year began in a snowbound country house, with Sangharakshita giving the first of many seminars on Buddhist texts and drawing from his disciples new levels of inspiration and commitment.
Although my bowels ooze out and my head falls, I will not bow down before my everlasting enemies, the passions.
This is a bit reminiscent of the Buddha's famous word.
I think it's the suggestion of struggle, it appears to me, of a battle.
But it seems to appeal to God today.
About a month after my ordination, I went on the Bodhicharya Avatara retreat, and that made a very, very strong impression on me because of the impression of the Bodhisattva ideal, and particularly, sort of a non-psychological approach. I'd had quite a psychological approach to spiritual life, and I had a very strong glimpse of we're just getting stuck in using work and helping other people and trying to spread the Dharma as a way of, kind of overcoming my own problems, as it were, just ignoring them virtually. So I came back from that with my feeling of going for refuge and my feeling of membership of the order, what I'd done in ordination, very, very much reinforced with a determination just to fling myself into things, which is what I did.